April 8, 1943. 27,000 feet above Conches-en-Ouche, France. The oxygen mask couldn't hide Oberleutnant Ralph Hermichen's smirk as he watched the ungainly silhouettes climbing laboriously toward his formation through the crystal-clear canopy of his Fokker-Wulf 190. A 5. "They have sent us flying milk bottles," Hermichen joked over the radio to his wingman, his voice crackling with contempt. From the cockpit of his Fokker-Wulf, Hermichen saw everything that made these new American fighters objects of ridicule among the Jagdwaffe. The P-47 Thunderbolts' barrel-shaped fuselages looked grotesquely swollen, as if someone had inflated a fighter aircraft until it was ready to burst. Their greenhouse canopies sat atop the fuselage like afterthoughts, providing visibility but destroying any pretense of aerodynamic grace. The stubby wings seemed impossibly small for the hulking frames they carried to German pilots accustomed to the elegant lines of Spitfires and the purposeful menace of Soviet Yaks. These American machines looked almost comical. The massive radial engine cowling dominated the forward profile, giving each aircraft the appearance of a flying beer keg with wings. Even from this distance, Hermichen could see the telltale glint of the enormous belly-mounted drop tank, that every Thunderbolt carried another 200 gallons of fuel hanging beneath an already bloated airframe. To the battle-hardened veterans of the Luftwaffe, men who had fought over Britain, Russia, and North Africa, the P-47 looked less like a weapon of war and more like a bizarre experiment in how much metal you could hang from a propeller before it refused to fly. And this contempt was not born of idle arrogance. In the spring of 1943, the Luftwaffe over-occupied France, represented perhaps the most lethal concentration of fighter pilots ever assembled. These were not the green recruits being rushed to the Eastern Front, but the elite of the Jagdgeschwader men with Iron Crosses and Knight's Crosses, men whose combined kill counts exceeded 1,000 Allied aircraft. Hermichen himself had 34 confirmed victories, and he was merely average among his squadron. His Staffelkapitan had 68. The Fuhr 190A5 that Hermichen flew was a masterpiece of German engineering, faster than anything the British could field below 20,000 feet, more heavily armed than any fighter in Europe, and flown by pilots who had been honing their craft since 1940. In the previous year, 1942, Luftwaffe fighters over France had maintained an average kill ratio of nearly 3-1 against Royal Air Force intruders. British Spitfire and Typhoon pilots had learned to respect the deadly efficiency of these men. When the Americans arrived with their lumbering heavy bombers in late 1942, escorted initially by nothing but prayer and hope, German fighter pilots had enjoyed what they called a turkey shoot, massacring B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds that had ventured beyond the limited range of RAF escorts. The P-47 seconds represented America's answer to this crisis, and from where Hermichen sat, the answer appeared to be a joke. But what they didn't know, what none of them could possibly know as they positioned for another easy interception, was that within 6 months, these same men would flinch at the sound of 8 Browning M2 machine guns opening fire from high altitude. By the summer of 1944, the distinctive roar of a P-47's Pratt & Whitney R-2800 would send German pilots diving for cloud cover before they even saw the threat. The flying milk bottles, they mocked in April 1943, would destroy more than 7,000 Luftwaffe aircraft, in aerial combat alone, more than any other Allied fighter type. The same pilots who laughed at the P-47's bulk would learn that its 7-ton weight translated into energy that could never be bled off in a dive, that its 8 50-caliber machine guns carried enough ammunition to saw a German fighter in half, and that the enormous fuel capacity they ridiculed meant Thunderbolts could hunt them anywhere over France, Belgium, and Germany. There was no sanctuary, no distance too far, no altitude too high. The statistics would be merciless. In the crucial battles of 1944, P-47 seconds would achieve a kill ratio exceeding 4-6-1, destroying not just fighters, but systematically annihilating the Luftwaffe's infrastructure, its locomotives, its fuel trucks, its supply columns, its ability to move or think or breathe. This story is about how industrial logic defeated tactical brilliance, how quantity and quality merged into overwhelming superiority, and how the Luftwaffe's laughter turned to terror as they discovered what American Thunderbolts could do when American pilots learned to fly them correctly, when American engineers perfected them, and when American factories built them faster than Germany could train pilots to replace the dead. But that April morning, Major Donald Blakesley, leading the 4th Fighter Group's first P-47 combat mission, understood what his men didn't yet know, that they were flying into battle in an aircraft whose potential was completely untapped, whose strengths were all theoretical, and whose weaknesses were immediately, lethally obvious. I gripped the control stick and felt the characteristic sluggishness of the big fighter at altitude. Blakesley would later recall, "The aircraft felt like it was fighting me, not the enemy. We had perhaps 60 hours of transition training between us and the pilots we were supposed to protect. The W-192nd climbing toward us had years. Blakesley had fought in Spitfires with the Eagle squadrons before America entered the war, and he knew exactly what German fighters could do. The P-47 responded to control inputs like a freight train, trying to dance every movement required anticipation, force, and patience. At 25,000 feet, where the Germans preferred to fight, the early P-47 seconds climbed at barely 1,500 feet per minute. An FRE 190 could climb at nearly double that rate. In a turning fight, the comparison was even more devastating. The P-47 needed nearly twice the turning radius of its German opponents. Blakesley watched his formation spread out, each pilot fighting to maintain position in aircraft they barely understood, and he knew that in the next few minutes, some of these men were going to die. The Luftwaffe had centuries of combined combat experience. His pilots had logbooks full of training flights and hope. The German fighters were positioning now, converting their altitude advantage into the perfect bounce. Hermichen selected his target, a P-47, lagging slightly behind the formation, its pilot clearly struggling with the unfamiliar aircraft. This was going to be simple. The procedure was textbook. Dive from above and behind, use the speed advantage to close rapidly, fire a concentrated burst into the engine or cockpit, break away before the target's wingmen could react. Hermichen had executed this maneuver dozens of times. The target's massive size meant he couldn't miss. I rolled inverted and pulled the stick back, Hermichen recalled years later, and that's when I realized something was wrong. The American wasn't turning to meet me, he was diving straight down. In my entire combat career, I had never seen a fighter deliberately dive away from an advantageous position. But this American was accelerating away from me, and my Focke-Wulf, which had seemed so fast moments before, felt like it was standing still. The American pilot Hermichen had selected was Lieutenant Quince Brown, a farm boy from North Carolina flying his 3rd combat mission. I saw the German coming, and I did what Major Zemke had drilled into us during training. I pushed the stick forward and dove. The P-47 fell out of the sky like a meteor. The engine roar became a scream. The airspeed indicator blurred past 450 miles per hour, then 500. Behind me, I could see the FOV-190 trying to follow, but the distance between us was opening. At 15,000 feet, I pulled back on the stick, using all my strength, and the big fighter responded, converting that terrifying velocity into a climb so steep it seemed impossible. By the time I leveled out at 22,000 feet, the German was nowhere to be seen. I was shaking, breathing hard, alive. Brown didn't understand it then, none of them did, but he had just demonstrated the fundamental advantage that would eventually make the P-47 master of European skies. That 7-ton weight that seemed like a fatal flaw at low speeds became an unstoppable force at high speeds. The turbocharged engine that barely functioned at low altitude delivered massive power above 25,000 feet. The enormous fuel capacity meant every dive could be followed by a climb, every engagement could extend beyond where German fighters dared follow. Below, Hermichen pulled out of his dive and rejoined his formation, frustrated but not concerned. The Americans had run away. By the official scoring of aerial combat, this was a victory. The bombers they had been escorting were now unprotected, vulnerable. But as he flew back toward his base at Beaumont-le-Roger, Hermichen noted something strange in his combat report. Enemy fighter achieved sustained dive speed exceeding 520 miles per hour. Unable to close distance during pursuit. Unusual acceleration and climb characteristics observed. He didn't know it. But he had just filed one of the first reports documenting what would become the Luftwaffe's nightmare. A fighter that shouldn't work but refused to die. A blunt instrument that would be refined into a precision weapon. A joke that would have the final, crushing laugh. The P-47 Thunderbolt was never supposed to exist. It was born from desperation, panic, and the sudden, terrifying realization that America had no fighter capable of escorting bombers deep into German territory. When France fell in June 1940, the entire calculus of aerial warfare changed overnight. The comfortable distance provided by the English Channel evaporated. Luftwaffe fighters could now operate from bases mere minutes from British cities. The U.S. Army Air Corps, watching from across the Atlantic, understood that when not if America entered this war, it would need a fighter that could carry the battle to the heart of Nazi-occupied Europe. Republic Aviation's chief designer, Alexander Kartveli, sat down with a blank sheet of paper and a seemingly impossible set of requirements. Build a fighter with twice the range of anything currently flying, arm it heavily enough to destroy German bombers, make it fast enough to catch anything in the sky, and deliver it in massive quantities within 2 years. The result was the P-47, an aircraft so large and heavy that it violated every principle of fighter design that had evolved since the Wright brothers. The prototype XP-47B first flew in May 1941, and the problems were immediately apparent. The aircraft weighed 12,700 pounds empty, nearly twice the weight of a Spitfire. The massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine produced 2,000 horsepower, but required an equally massive turbocharger system that added complexity, weight, and countless potential failure points. The cockpit sat so far back from the nose that forward visibility on the ground was almost non-existent. Pilots had to snake the aircraft left and right during taxi just to see where they were going. The control forces were enormous. At high speeds, it took both hands and significant physical strength just to move the control column. Test pilots reported that the ailerons felt like they were welded in place above 400 miles per hour. Engineering problems plagued development. The turbocharger system failed repeatedly. The engine overheated. The landing gear collapsed. The canopy fogged. The guns jammed. Production delays mounted. By the time the first operational P-47 seconds reached England in late 1942, they were already obsolete by conventional standards, heavier and less maneuverable than fighters the Germans had been flying for 2 years. Major Hubert Hubb, Zemke, commanding officer of the 56th Fighter Group, initially despised the aircraft with a passion that bordered on hatred. Zemke was a respected test pilot and combat veteran who had observed Luftwaffe tactics in Russia. When the P-47 seconds arrived at his base in England, he took one look at the enormous fighters and requested an immediate transfer back to the United States. His superiors denied the request. "Fly the aircraft," they told him. "Learn it. Make it work." What followed was a training program that became a nightmare of crashes, failures, and death. The 56th Fighter Group lost 18 pilots and 41 aircraft in training accidents before they ever encountered a single German fighter. Pilots died in landing accidents because the long nose blocked their forward view. They died when the complex engine systems failed. They died when they tried to turn fight in practice dogfights and stalled into the ground. They died when oxygen systems malfunctioned at high altitude. The P-47 killed more Americans in training than German fighters would kill in the first 3 months of combat operations. Insurance companies began refusing to cover P-47 pilots. Mechanics nicknamed the aircraft the 7-ton milk bottle and the Thunderjug, terms that were not affectionate. Test pilots approaching the P-47 for the first time invariably asked the same question. "This thing actually flies?" Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson, a 2-year-old from Lawton, Oklahoma, asked exactly that when he first saw his assigned aircraft at Bridgeport, Connecticut, in early 1943. "I walked around that massive machine 3 times, Johnson recalled decades later, looking for the railroad tracks it must have arrived on. The fuselage was wider than I was tall. The propeller blades were 11 feet long. The wings contained enough fuel for a cross-country bus trip. Everything about it screamed bomber, except for the single seat in the cockpit." Johnson's initial training flights confirmed his worst fears. The P-47 accelerated like a freight train, slowly, reluctantly, as if questioning why it should bother. It climbed even worse. At low altitude, a Piper Cub could outturn it. The controls required such force that Johnson's shoulders ached after every flight. When he mentioned his concerns to his squadron commander, the response was blunt. "Nobody cares what you think, Lieutenant. Learn to fly it or wash out." By June 1943, Johnson had logged barely 60 combat hours in the P-47, most of them uneventful escort missions where German fighters refused to engage. The Luftwaffe had learned that attacking the P-47 seconds directly was unproductive, better to ignore them and concentrate on the bombers. On June 26th, Johnson was flying escort for B-17 seconds, returning from a raid on Paris when his luck catastrophically ran out. A formation of 190 seconds dove through the escort screen, and Johnson broke to intercept. "I made every mistake a new pilot could make," he later admitted. "I chased them, instead of maintaining altitude. I fixated on one target, instead of checking my 6. I flew into a trap that I should have seen coming from a mile away." The first 20mm cannon shell hit Johnson's P-47, just behind the cockpit, with a sound like a sledgehammer striking a steel drum. The explosive round detonated against the fuselage, sending shrapnel through the internal structure. Before Johnson could react, the attacking W-190 flown by Oberleutnant Egon Meyer, an ace with 78 kills, fired again, and again, and again. 21 20mm high-explosive rounds struck Johnson's aircraft in a systematic, methodical destruction that should have been unsurvivable. The canopy shattered into 1,000 fragments, filling the cockpit with cutting glass. A round exploded in the engine cowling, and flame erupted from the cowl flaps. The instrument panel disintegrated. Another round struck the armor plate behind Johnson's head, and the impact felt like being hit by a car. The control stick was shot away. The rudder pedals were shot away. Oil from the destroyed engine coated the shattered windscreen, mixing with hydraulic fluid and fuel in a toxic, flammable spray. The aircraft rolled inverted and began falling, spinning, breaking apart. Johnson was trapped in a dying aircraft that was also on fire, 20,000 feet above occupied France, with an ace German pilot still hammering rounds into the wreckage. "I couldn't bail out," Johnson recalled, his voice still carrying the memory of pure terror even 50 years later. The canopy was jammed. The aircraft was spinning so violently I couldn't reach the emergency release. I was pinned by G-forces against my seat, watching flames crawl toward the cockpit, knowing I had perhaps 30 seconds before the fuel tanks exploded. I wasn't thinking about tactics or training or patriotism. I was thinking about my mother and how she would receive the telegram. Egon Meyer closed to less than 20 yards point-blank range and fired his remaining ammunition directly into what remained of Johnson's P-47. The cannon rounds walked up the fuselage, each impact visible, each hit certain to be fatal. Meyer expended every round from his 4 20mm cannons and 2 13mm machine guns. Over 200 rounds. Into an aircraft the size of a small house, at a range where missing was impossible. The P-47 should have exploded, should have disintegrated, should have done what every combat manual, every tactical doctrine, every experienced pilot knew it would do: break apart into flaming debris. It didn't. The aircraft kept flying, bent, shattered, trailing smoke and flames, missing large sections of its tail, with the canopy gone and the pilot exposed to the 300 miles per hour slipstream but flying. The R-2800 engine, with half its cylinders destroyed, continued turning the propeller. The wings, perforated like Swiss cheese, continued generating lift. The control surfaces, shot to pieces, continued providing some directional control. Johnson wrestled the crippled aircraft back toward level flight, using the emergency trim controls, both hands on the trim wheel, his face bleeding from glass cuts, his shoulders dislocated from the G-forces. Operating on instinct and desperation, Meyer positioned his Fokker-Wulf alongside Johnson's P-47 to observe the death of his victim. Johnson could see Meyer's face through the German's canopy, close enough to see his expression shifting from professional satisfaction to confusion to something approaching fear. Meyer stared at the wreckage, still flying beside him, at the American pilot still conscious in the cockpit, at the aircraft that refused to die despite wounds that would have destroyed 3 Spitfires. Meyer checked his ammunition counter empty. He had fired everything. He shook his head in apparent amazement, gave an informal salute, and peeled away, leaving Johnson alone in the burning, crippled fighter. "I flew that destroyed aircraft for 45 minutes back to England," Johnson later testified. "No canopy, no instruments, no hydraulics, no radios. The engine was running on 4 cylinders instead of 18. I navigated by dead reckoning and pure luck. When I reached the English coast, I fired my emergency flares because I couldn't radio ahead. When I landed, and I use that term loosely, the emergency crews counted the holes. 21 cannon shell hits. More than 200 bullet holes. The right wing had a hole large enough to crawl through. The tail section was held on by 2 spars out of 12. The armor plate behind my seat had stopped 3 rounds, any one of which would have cut me in half. The engineering officer looked at the wreckage and said it wasn't structurally possible for the aircraft to have flown at all, let alone for 45 minutes. Republic Aviation sent investigators who took thousands of photographs. The aircraft was coded as a total loss, too damaged to repair, but they studied every inch of it, trying to understand how it had survived. The photographs from Johnson's aircraft reached the engineering teams at Republic's Farmingdale factory within 48 hours. They were circulated among the design staff with a simple notation: "This is what combat looks like." The myth of the fragile fighter was dead. The engineers saw that the P-47's massive size, which they had considered a compromise forced by the turbocharger installation, had created redundancy. Multiple spars meant that destroying one didn't cause structural failure. The enormous fuselage meant vital systems could be separated. A hit to the engine didn't damage the cockpit. A hit to the tail didn't affect flight controls. The armor plate they had installed, weighing hundreds of pounds, had saved lives. Every pound they had reluctantly added to meet military specifications had purchased survivability. News of Johnson's survival spread through the 8th Air Force like wildfire. Pilots who had cursed the P-47's weight and sluggishness began to see it differently. That 7 tons of metal and armor meant 7 tons of protection. The aircraft that had seemed like a flying bathtub began to look like a flying tank. Maintenance crews painted half a P-47 on Johnson's replacement aircraft. The name stuck. When German intelligence received reports of the incident from Mayer's debriefing, the response was dismissive. Combat stress, exaggeration, impossible. But Mayer's report was precise, detailed, and supported by his wingman's observations. A Luftwaffe technical team reviewed American P-47 design specifications captured from a shot-down aircraft and added a notation to their intelligence files. Extraordinary structural strength. Extreme survivability. Do not assume standard combat damage will result in kills. Within 6 weeks, similar reports began flooding Luftwaffe intelligence from across the Western Front, P-47 seconds returning to England with damage that should have killed them. German pilots emptying their ammunition into American fighters that refused to fall. The joke was over. The milk bottles were bulletproof. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It required a specific type of leader, someone willing to abandon every conventional assumption about fighter combat, someone arrogant enough to believe he could rewrite the tactical manual while German aces were shooting down his pilots. That leader was Hubert Zemke, the same man who had initially despised the P-47, the same commander who had watched his pilots die in training accidents. By August 1943, Zemke had logged over 200 combat hours in the Thunderbolt, and somewhere in those hours of combat, watching, learning, surviving, he had an epiphany that would change the war. Zemke gathered his squadron commanders at Halesworth Airfield on a cold morning in late August and delivered what became known as Zemke's Rules, a complete inversion of fighter doctrine that had governed aerial combat since World War I. Rule 1. Don't turn with the enemy. Every fighter pilot since 1917 had been taught that victory went to the pilot who could outturn his opponent, who could bring his guns to bear in the tightest circle. Zemke declared this orthodoxy obsolete, even suicidal in a P-47. Rule 2. Use your weight. The 7 tons that made the P-47 sluggish in a turning fight became an unstoppable force in a dive. An FTU-190 diving, after a P-47, would reach its compressibility limits, the point where control surfaces became ineffective at around 500 miles per hour. The P-47 was stable, controllable, and accelerating at 550 miles per hour. The turbocharged R-2800 engine produced maximum power above 25,000 feet, precisely where German fighters were weakest. Rule 4. Never chase. Every dive was followed by a zoom climb back to altitude, using the P-47's energy retention to regain the high ground before the enemy could respond. The tactic Zemke codified became known officially as boom and zoom, though pilots called it the Thunderbolt turkey shoot. The geometry was brutally simple. Maintain altitude superiority, dive at speeds the enemy couldn't match, fire a concentrated burst from 8.50 caliber machine guns, 3,400 rounds per minute of armor-piercing, incendiary, and high-explosive ammunition, then convert speed into altitude, climbing back above the enemy before they could react. The P-47 didn't need to outturn German fighters. It needed to hit them so hard they never had a chance to turn. We stopped trying to fight their fight, Zemke explained to a war correspondent in September 1943. We made them fight our fight. And in our fight, mass and firepower beat agility every single time. The proof came on August 17th, 1943, during the catastrophic Schweinfurt-Regensburg raid, a daylight bombing mission that pushed deep into Germany, far beyond the range of any escort fighter. The B-17 seconds flew unescorted for hundreds of miles, and the Luftwaffe slaughtered them, destroying 60 bombers and damaging hundreds more. But on the return leg, as the surviving B-17 seconds limped back toward England, the 56 Fighter Group met them at the edge of the escort range near the German-Belgian border. Zemke's pilots found a formation of May 110 heavy fighters attacking the crippled bombers from behind. The twin-engine Messerschmitts, using their heavy 20mm and 30mm cannons to systematically blast B-17 seconds out of the sky. Lieutenant Friedrich Weber, serving as rear gunner in an Me-110 of Geschwader 26, saw the P-47 seconds approaching from high altitude. "We had destroyed 2 American bombers in the previous 5 minutes," Weber recalled years later. "Our pilot was positioning for a third attack when I called out the American fighters. They were at least 5,000 feet above us, diving. I opened fire at 800 meters, good hits on the lead aircraft, sparks jumping from his wing. The P-47 didn't even wobble. Then he fired. I had never experienced anything like it. The 8 machine guns produced a sound like a continuous explosion, a sustained roar of destruction. The aircraft ahead of us simply came apart, the fuselage ripped open from nose to tail, the wings folded upward, the crew compartment shredded into metal confetti. The P-47 flashed past at impossible speed, pulled into a vertical climb, and was gone before our pilot could even think about maneuvering. In the next 90 seconds, Zemke's Wolfpack destroyed 11 May 110 seconds without losing a single aircraft. The German heavy fighters, purpose-built bomber destroyers carrying devastating firepower, were helpless against the tactic. They couldn't climb fast enough to escape, couldn't turn tight enough to evade, couldn't survive the concentrated firepower of 8 50-caliber machine guns converging on target. The rear gunners fired desperately at the diving Thunderbolts, their 7.92mm rounds sparking harmlessly off armor plate. The German pilots tried diving away, but the P-47 seconds simply followed, accelerating, closing, firing. Weber's pilot managed to reach cloud cover, but only because 2 other May 110 seconds had absorbed the attacks meant for him. "We landed with our entire formation destroyed or damaged," Weber testified after the war. The tactical officer asked for our report. I told him the American fighters had learned how to use their aircraft. He didn't believe me. Within a week, he saw it himself. The massacre of ZG-26 sent shockwaves through Luftwaffe high command. Me 110 seconds had been untouchable by most Allied fighters, too fast to catch, too heavily armed to engage head-on, protected by fighter escorts. The P-47 seconds had destroyed them like target practice. Intelligence officers interviewed surviving crews, analyzed gun camera footage, and reached an uncomfortable conclusion. The Americans had developed tactics that exploited weaknesses the Germans didn't know they had. A confidential memorandum circulated through Fighter Command in September 1943 warned pilots that engaging P-47 seconds above 25,000 feet was extremely hazardous and recommended avoiding combat unless overwhelming numerical superiority could be achieved. But the tactical revolution was only half the transformation. In October 1943, Republic Aviation implemented a modification that turned the P-47 from a high-altitude fighter into something approaching a superweapon. The change seemed minor, replacing the standard propeller with a new Curtiss electric paddle blade design that had wider, squared-off blade tips. The engineering logic was straightforward. The wider blades converted the R-2800's horsepower more efficiently into thrust, particularly at high altitude, where standard propellers lost effectiveness. The performance improvement was dramatic. Climb rate at 25,000 feet increased by 23%. Maximum speed increased by 15 miles per hour. Most critically, the P-47 could now follow FAVU 190 seconds and BF 109 seconds into climbs that had previously been sanctuaries. Lieutenant Hans Stiegler, a BF 109 pilot with Jagdgeschwader 2, recorded the shock of this upgrade in his diary entry, dated November 3, 1943. The fat American fighters have learned to climb. Today, 3 of them followed us up to 30,000 feet, an altitude we thought was safe. They followed us. At 30,000 feet, Schmidt was caught at 31,000 feet and blown apart by concentrated fire. These are not the same machines we laughed at last year. We need new tactics immediately, or we will be massacred. The psychological impact was profound. For 2 years, Luftwaffe pilots had controlled the vertical dimension of combat. They climbed when threatened, dove when attacking, confident that Allied fighters couldn't follow into the thin air above 25,000 feet. The paddle blade P-47 seconds shattered that assumption. There was no sanctuary, no altitude beyond reach, no escape by climbing. German fighter pilots began reporting encounters where Thunderbolts initiated combat at 33,000 feet and still had the power to maneuver aggressively. The Americans had eliminated the Luftwaffe's last tactical advantage. Zemke's 56th Fighter Group became a testing ground for aggressive escort tactics that maximized the P-47's newfound strengths. Instead of staying close to the bomber formations, the standard doctrine that made fighters easy targets for German fighters with altitude advantage, Zemke's pilots roamed 20 miles ahead and 5,000 feet above the bombers, hunting for German fighters before they could set up attacks. We became predators instead of defenders, Captain Walker, Bud Mahurin, recalled. We learned that the best way to protect bombers was to destroy the enemy fighters before they reached the bombers. The P-47 gave us the range to do that. The altitude performance gave us the advantage. The firepower gave us the kills. The firepower was unlike anything German pilots had encountered. Each of the 8 Browning M2, 50-caliber machine guns fired 850 rounds per minute. Combined, they delivered 425 pounds of ammunition per minute onto target, a mix of armor-piercing incendiaries that could penetrate engine blocks, standard ball ammunition for structural damage, and tracer rounds for targeting. The ammunition load was 3,400 rounds, enough for 34 seconds of continuous fire, or more practically, enough for 15 to 23-second bursts. German fighters typically carried enough ammunition for 7 to 8 seconds of firing time. The P-47 could engage, miss, re-engage, and still have ammunition remaining. Pilots discovered that even near misses were effective. 50-caliber rounds exploding near cockpits caused devastating fragmentation, hydraulic fluid fires, control surface failures. In December 1943, Major Gerald Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group engaged an FW-190 over Bremen. The German pilot attempted the standard evasion, a hard brake left followed by a snap roll right, a maneuver designed to throw off aim and create separation. Johnson didn't try to follow the turn. I pulled up slightly, waited for him to complete the roll, and fired a 2-second burst at where he would be, not where he was, Johnson explained in his combat report. The convergence of 8, 50-caliber streams created a kill zone roughly 10 feet in diameter. The Fu-190 flew directly into it. The effect was instantaneous. The canopy exploded. The left wing sheared off at the root. The fuselage broke in half. Destroy, not damage. Kill, not cripple. That became our standard. By January 1944, Luftwaffe loss rates over Germany had reached unsustainable levels. Fighter groups that had maintained numerical strength through 1943 were now losing pilots faster than replacement training could produce them. The losses were concentrated among experienced pilots, men who remembered when Fu-190 seconds and Bf-109 seconds were superior to anything the Allies could field, men who engaged P-47 seconds out of habit and pride, men who discovered too late that the rules had changed. A Luftwaffe tactical assessment dated January 1944 coldly quantified the disaster. P-47 engagement results in average pilot survival time of 11 combat missions. Previous 6-month average, 43 missions. Recommended response: avoid engagement when possible. If engagement unavoidable, maintain formations. Attack with numerical superiority. Disengage immediately after first pass. The memo was a tacit admission that the Luftwaffe no longer sought victory in fighter versus fighter combat. They sought survival. The Thunder was no longer a joke. It was a killing machine, piloted by men who had learned its secrets, supported by an industrial base that could replace losses faster than they occurred, unleashed on an enemy that had run out of tactical answers. And the worst was yet to come. The transformation from tactical innovation to industrial annihilation reached its crescendo in the spring and summer of 1944. Between D-Day on June 6th and the liberation of Paris on August 25th, P-47 Thunderbolts destroyed 86,000 German vehicles, 9,000 locomotives, 6,000 armoured vehicles, and shot down 3,752 Luftwaffe aircraft. The numbers were so staggering that Allied intelligence officers initially refused to believe them, suspecting pilots of inflating claims. Verification teams using aerial reconnaissance photographs confirmed the statistics were, if anything, conservative. The P-47 groups were not fighting a war, they were conducting an industrial-scale extermination of everything that moved on roads, rails, or in the air across occupied France. The psychological impact on German ground forces created a phenomenon. Wehrmacht doctors classified as Jahrbuschreck fighter-bomber terror, a condition similar to shell shock, but triggered specifically by the sound of approaching P-47 seconds. Soldiers who had survived the Eastern Front, who had endured artillery barrages and tank assaults, broke completely when they heard the distinctive roar of 18-cylinder radial engines. Obergefreiter Klaus Dietrich, an infantry veteran with 4 years of combat experience, described the condition in his diary. "We can face Russian tanks. We can face artillery. We cannot face the Thunderbolts. The sound alone, before we even see them, causes men to abandon equipment and run for any cover. I have seen sergeants with iron crosses curl into fetal positions and weep. The Americans own the sky, and everything beneath it dies. Yesterday, they caught our supply column in open country. 40 trucks, gone in 8 minutes. Today they caught us. I survived by lying in a roadside ditch covered in the blood of my friends. I am 23 years old, and I am broken." The tactical evolution of the P-47 from high-altitude escort to low-altitude ground attack fighter represented one of the most successful adaptations in aviation history. The same structural strength that allowed the aircraft to survive aerial combat damage also permitted it to carry enormous external ordnance loads. By the summer of 1944, standard P-47D models routinely operated with 500-pound bombs under each wing, 10 5-inch rockets, and full ammunition for all 8 machine guns, a payload approaching 3 tons, equivalent to a medium bomber. The aircraft that German pilots had mocked as too heavy now weaponized that weight, converting mass into destructive capacity that redefined ground attack warfare. The interdiction campaign targeting French railways illustrated the methodical efficiency of the P-47 groups. Each locomotive destroyed meant 20 to 30 freight cars immobilized. Each destroyed freight car potentially carried enough ammunition, fuel, or spare parts to sustain a German division for weeks. Major Robert Basler, commanding the 325th Fighter Group, perfected the technique. We approached at treetop level to avoid radar detection. The lead flight would strafe the locomotive with armor-piercing incendiaries to penetrate the boiler and create a steam explosion. The following flights would destroy the cars with rockets and bombs. A typical attack lasted less than 2 minutes. By the time German flak batteries could respond, we were 10 miles away. The locomotives became priority targets because they couldn't be replaced. Germany's rail infrastructure was already strained beyond capacity by Allied strategic bombing. Destroying French locomotives meant German reinforcements moved by truck, which consumed precious fuel, or marched on foot, which took weeks. Oberleutnant Werner Hoffmann, a logistics officer with the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division, documented the cascading failure of German logistics in occupied France. June 8th. Rail transport to Normandy cancelled all locomotives between Paris and the coast destroyed or damaged. Division ordered to move by road. June 10th. Lost 14 fuel trucks to air attack near Argentan. Remaining vehicles immobilized. June 15th. Attempted night movement. Allied aircraft dropped flares and destroyed convoy. 67 vehicles lost. June 18th. Division officially combat ineffective due to lack of supplies. We have tanks without fuel, artillery without shells, wounded without medical supplies. The division is disintegrating not from combat but from starvation. The Americans don't need to fight us. They just need to ensure nothing reaches us. The industrial capacity that produced this dominance operated at a scale German planners could barely comprehend. At peak production in early 1944, Republic Aviation's Farmingdale, New York factory completed one P-47 Thunderbolt every 63 minutes, 24 hours per day, 7 days per week. The production line stretched for half a mile through the factory floor. Raw aluminum entered at one end, finished fighters rolled out at the other. Workers operated in 3 shifts, the factory never stopped. Curtiss-Wright manufactured the R-2800 engines in New Jersey at a rate exceeding 1,000 per month. Curtiss Electric in Buffalo produced propellers. Hundreds of subcontractors provided components, hydraulic systems from Ohio, instruments from Massachusetts, radios from Illinois. The logistical coordination required to synchronize this production rivaled the complexity of the actual combat operations the aircraft supported. By June 1944, the United States had produced 15,636 P-47 Thunderbolts. Another 25 per day were entering service. The 8th and 9th Air Forces in England operated over 1,800 P-47 seconds simultaneously, with complete replacement aircraft available for every combat loss within 48 hours. The training pipeline produced 300 qualified P-47 pilots per month. Ammunition production exceeded 10 million rounds of .50 caliber per month, enough to give every operational P-47 pilot a complete ammunition reload every 4 days. Oil reserves, spare parts, tires, radios, and every component necessary to sustain operations were stockpiled in quantities that assumed 50% daily loss rates, sustained indefinitely. The United States had built a military machine predicated on the assumption of massive attrition, and then suffered minimal losses because the industrial superiority was so overwhelming that the enemy couldn't create attrition. The decisive moment came on January 1st, 1945, during Operation Bodenplatte, the Luftwaffe's final, desperate gamble to destroy Allied air power on the ground. German High Command assembled nearly every operational fighter they possessed, over 900 aircraft, for coordinated surprise attacks on Allied airfields in Belgium, Holland, and France. The planning was meticulous, the execution precise. Attacking at dawn, flying at treetop level to avoid radar, German fighters achieved complete tactical surprise. At WWII airfield in Asch, Belgium, home to the 352nd Fighter Group, 2th 190 seconds, and BF 109 seconds, strafed parked P-47 seconds, destroying 25 aircraft in the opening minutes. Major George Preddy, the top P-47 ace in Europe, with 26.83 kills, was killed by American anti-aircraft fire during the chaotic defensive response, a devastating loss that seemed to symbolize the Luftwaffe's resurgence. Across 9 targeted airfields, German fighters destroyed 144 Allied aircraft, damaged 84 more, and killed dozens of pilots and ground crew. By any tactical measure, Operation Bodenplatte was a stunning success. The celebration lasted approximately 6 hours. Hauptmann Franz Götz, a Bf 109 pilot who participated in the Asch raid, landed at his base at Nidda and found the commanding officer in a state of barely controlled rage. "We destroyed at least 25 P-47 seconds," Götz reported proudly. "The American field was burning." The CO looked at me as if I were insane. "We lost 41 pilots this morning," he said. "Irreplaceable veterans, killed or captured, for 25 American aircraft." I started to protest that we had struck a significant blow when he handed me a reconnaissance photograph taken by a high-altitude Arado jet. The image showed WWII airfield. I counted the P-47 seconds visible on the ground. There were 37 aircraft, more than had been there before the attack. Götz stared at the photograph, uncomprehending. "How is this possible?" he asked. "We destroyed their fighters this morning." The answer arrived that afternoon in the form of an American liaison officer visiting a captured German airfield commander. The German, seeking to salvage some victory from the disaster, mentioned the successful destruction of 25 P-47 seconds at Asch. The American officer, a captain from IX Tactical Air Command Headquarters, smiled. "Yes," he confirmed. "You destroyed 25 aircraft. We'll have replacements flown in by tomorrow afternoon. 40 new P-47 seconds are currently aboard transport ships. They'll be uncrated, assembled, and operational within 36 hours. The German officer asked the obvious question. "How many pilots did you lose?" The American's smile vanished. 6 killed. Tragic, irreplaceable men. "But we have 200 replacement pilots currently in England awaiting assignment." The German officer, realizing the implications, asked the question that haunted him until his death decades later. "And you, how many fighters have we lost today?" The American checked his notes. "Our preliminary count shows 253 German aircraft destroyed, with another 90 probable. Your own records show 41 experienced pilots killed or missing." The German officer, according to the Americans' report, said nothing further. He simply sat down, put his head in his hands, and remained silent. The mathematics were merciless. Operation Bodenplatte had traded 277 German aircraft and 143 experienced pilots for 144 Allied aircraft and 23 pilots. The Allied losses would be replaced within 48 hours. The German losses, particularly the pilots, were irreplaceable. Training a replacement pilot to operational competence required 18 months, and fuel reserves Germany no longer possessed. The Luftwaffe had committed suicide, attacking a target that couldn't be permanently damaged. By February 1945, the 9th Air Force alone operated 2,087 P-47 seconds in continuous ground attack operations inside Germany. They flew 24 hours a day. Night fighters equipped with searchlights hunted German vehicle movements after dark. Anything that moved died. German divisions attempting to move to defensive positions found themselves immobilized by daylight air attacks, then destroyed piecemeal by ground forces. The Wehrmacht's tactical mobility, the foundation of Blitzkrieg doctrine, had been completely negated by an aircraft German pilots had mocked as a flying joke 2 years earlier. General Major Adolf Galland, commander of German fighter forces, wrote in his post-war memoirs, "We made a terrible mistake in 1943 when we dismissed the P-47 as tactically inferior. We measured it by the wrong standards: turn rate, climb rate, maneuverability. We were the ones who didn't understand. The Americans built a fighter for the war they needed to fight, not the war we wanted to fight. They didn't need maneuverability. They needed range, firepower, and industrial production capacity. They buried us under an avalanche of steel, and there was nothing we could do to stop it. Every German pilot learned to recognize the sound of a P-47 by the 18 cylinders, a deep, rhythmic thunder that announced death from above. We called it Roosevelt's piano, and it played our funeral dirge. The milk bottle had become an execution chamber. The joke had become a requiem. The sound haunted them for decades. Veterans of the Jagdwaffe, men who had fought across 4 continents, men who had survived thousands of combat missions, would wake screaming from nightmares triggered by the memory of 8 Browning M, 2 machine guns opening fire at high altitude. The distinctive report, a sustained, hammering roar that pilots called Roosevelt's piano, became a generational trauma burned into German collective memory. In 1967, during a reunion of Jagdgeschwader 26 veterans in Cologne, a former 5-190 pilot had a complete breakdown when a passing thunderstorm produced a sound that remotely resembled the firing pattern of a P-47. He collapsed, hyperventilating, transported back to 1944, to the moment when the thunder from above meant death was inescapable. His friends helped him to a quiet room, but they understood. They all heard it too. They would hear it until they died. General Lieutenant Adolf Galland, the legendary commander of German fighter forces, provided the most brutally honest assessment in his 1954 memoir, The First and the Last. The passage remains one of the most quoted admissions of tactical defeat in military history. We made a terrible mistake in 1943 when we dismissed the P-47 as tactically inferior because it couldn't turn with our fighters. By 1944, we understood our error. The P-47 didn't need to turn. It could climb to altitudes we couldn't reach, dive at speeds we couldn't follow, carry ordnance loads we couldn't imagine, and absorb damage that would destroy 3 of our aircraft. Most critically, when we shot one down, 2 more replaced it by the next morning. When they shot down one of ours, we could not replace the pilot. We were the ones who didn't understand what industrial warfare meant. The Americans didn't just build a good fighter, they built 15,683 of them. They didn't just train good pilots, they trained them faster than we could kill them. They didn't fight a tactical war, they fought a production war, and production was a battle we lost in 1942 before the first P-47 ever reached Europe. The numbers Galland referenced were more than statistics, they represented human lives destroyed on an industrial scale. Between January 1943 and May 1945, P-47 Thunderbolts were credited with destroying 11,874 enemy aircraft, 3,752 inches, aerial combat, and 8,122 on the ground. They destroyed 9,000 locomotives, 86,000 railroad cars, 68,000 trucks, 6,000 armored vehicles, and 60,000 horse-drawn vehicles. The final accounting of German pilots killed, wounded, or captured during the period of P-47 operations exceeded 23,000 men, an entire generation of the Luftwaffe's fighter force erased. For context, Germany trained approximately 30,000 fighter pilots during the entire war. The P-47 groups alone killed or removed from service more than three-quarters of the Luftwaffe's fighter pilot strength. The psychological toll extended beyond individual trauma to collective institutional collapse. Oberst Johannes Steinhoff, a Luftwaffe ace who survived the war with 176 kills, described the moment he knew Germany had lost the air war. It wasn't a specific battle or date, it was a sound. Late 1944, somewhere over Brandenburg, Steinhoff recalled. We had scrambled to intercept a formation of B-17 seconds. As we climbed to altitude, I heard it multiple P-47 formations above us, their engines at combat power, hunting. The sound was everywhere, omnipresent. We couldn't see them through the clouds, but we could hear them. 8 ship formations, maybe 20 total aircraft, circling like wolves, waiting for us to commit to attacking the bombers. We broke off. The mission was aborted. We flew home without engaging. That night, sitting in the officers' mess, no one spoke. We had just refused combat because we were afraid. Not tactically cautious, afraid. The Americans had made us afraid of our own sky. The transformation from April 8, 1943, 27,000 feet above Conches-en-Ouche, France. The oxygen mask couldn't hide Oberleutnant Ralph Hermichen's smirk as he watched the ungainly silhouettes climbing laboriously toward his formation through the crystal-clear canopy of his Fokker-Wulf 190. A 5. They have sent us flying milk bottles, Hermichen joked over the radio to his wingman, his voice crackling with contempt. From the cockpit of his Fokker-Wulf, Hermichen saw everything that made these new American fighters objects of ridicule among the Jagdwaffe. The P-47 Thunderbolts' barrel-shaped fuselages looked grotesquely swollen, as if someone had inflated a fighter aircraft until it was ready to burst. Their greenhouse canopies sat atop the fuselage like afterthoughts, providing visibility but destroying any pretense of aerodynamic grace. The stubby wings seemed impossibly small for the hulking frames they carried to German pilots accustomed to the elegant lines of Spitfires and the purposeful menace of Soviet Yaks. These American machines looked almost comical. The massive radial engine cowling dominated the forward profile, giving each aircraft the appearance of a flying beer keg with wings. Even from this distance, Hermichen could see the telltale glint of the enormous belly-mounted drop tank, that every Thunderbolt carried another 200 gallons of fuel hanging beneath an already bloated airframe. To the battle-hardened veterans of the Luftwaffe, men who had fought over Britain, Russia, and North Africa, the P-47 looked less like a weapon of war and more like a bizarre experiment in how much metal you could hang from a propeller before it refused to fly. And this contempt was not born of idle arrogance. In the spring of 1943, the Luftwaffe over-occupied France, represented perhaps the most lethal concentration of fighter pilots ever assembled. These were not the green recruits being rushed to the Eastern Front, but the elite of the Jagdgeschwader men with Iron Crosses and Knight's Crosses, men whose combined kill counts exceeded 1,000 Allied aircraft. Hermichen himself had 34 confirmed victories, and he was merely average among his squadron. His Staffelkapitan had 68. The Fuhr 190A5 that Hermichen flew was a masterpiece of German engineering, faster than anything the British could field below 20,000 feet, more heavily armed than any fighter in Europe, and flown by pilots who had been honing their craft since 1940. In the previous year, 1942, Luftwaffe fighters over France had maintained an average kill ratio of nearly 3-to-1 against Royal Air Force intruders. British Spitfire and Typhoon pilots had learned to respect the deadly efficiency of these men. When the Americans arrived with their lumbering heavy bombers in late 1942, escorted initially by nothing but prayer and hope, German fighter pilots had enjoyed what they called a turkey shoot, massacring B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds that had ventured beyond the limited range of RAF escorts. The P-47 seconds represented America's answer to this crisis, and from where Hermichen sat, the answer appeared to be a joke. But what they didn't know, what none of them could possibly know as they positioned for another easy interception, was that within 6 months, these same men would flinch at the sound of 8 Browning M, 2 machine guns opening fire from high altitude. By the summer of 1944, The distinctive roar of a P-47's Pratt & Whitney R-2800 would send German pilots diving for cloud cover before they even saw the threat. The flying milk bottles they mocked in April 1943 would destroy more than 7,000 Luftwaffe aircraft in aerial combat alone, more than any other Allied fighter type. The same pilots who laughed at the P-47's bulk would learn that its 7-ton weight translated into energy that could never be bled off in a dive, that its 8 50 caliber machine guns carried enough ammunition to saw a German fighter in half, and that the enormous fuel capacity they ridiculed meant Thunderbolts could hunt them anywhere over France, Belgium, and Germany. There was no sanctuary, no distance too far, no altitude too high. The statistics would be merciless. In the crucial battles of 1944, P-47 seconds would achieve a kill ratio exceeding 6 to 1, destroying not just fighters, but systematically annihilating the Luftwaffe's infrastructure, its locomotives, its fuel trucks, its supply columns, its ability to move or think or breathe. This story is about how industrial logic defeated tactical brilliance, how quantity and quality merged into overwhelming superiority, and how the Luftwaffe's laughter turned to terror as they discovered what American Thunderbolts could do when American pilots learned to fly them correctly, when American engineers perfected them, and when American factories built them faster than Germany could train pilots to replace the dead. But that April morning, Major Donald Blakesley, leading the 4th Fighter Group's first P-47 combat mission, understood what his men didn't yet know, that they were flying into battle in an aircraft whose potential was completely untapped, whose strengths were all theoretical, and whose weaknesses were immediately, lethally obvious. I gripped the control stick and felt the characteristic sluggishness of the big fighter at altitude. Blakesley would later recall, "The aircraft felt like it was fighting me, not the enemy. We had perhaps 60 hours of transition training between us and the pilots we were supposed to protect. The W-190 seconds climbing toward us had years. Blakesley had fought in Spitfires with the Eagle squadrons before America entered the war, and he knew exactly what German fighters could do. The P-47 responded to control inputs like a freight train. Trying to dance every movement required anticipation, force, and patience. At 25,000 feet, where the Germans preferred to fight, the early P-47 seconds climbed at barely 1,500 feet per minute. An FRE 190 could climb at nearly double that rate. In a turning fight, the comparison was even more devastating. The P-47 needed nearly twice the turning radius of its German opponents. Blakesley watched his formation spread out, each pilot fighting to maintain position in aircraft they barely understood, and he knew that in the next few minutes, some of these men were going to die. The Luftwaffe had centuries of